Hey, youth workers, this is Jeremy Del Rio from Thrive Collective in New York. As we record this video, on this very day, there's another school shooting in Texas that has claimed the life of at least 8 kids. We know this to be an epidemic. We know that mass shootings in our country are insanely common. They claim far too many lives. And it seems that the trigger person in these shootings is usually a loner, usually somebody who has been on the fringes, somebody who has felt disconnected, who has suffered loss, but what they seem to have in common is they don't have a relational support system around them. They don't have people that have invested in their lives. And they're running around and they're acting desperate and they're doing horribly violent, tragic things, causing untold pain in our communities, among our kids, particularly when it happens at schools. As we wrestle with what to do with this, I want to introduce you a teenager who brings me comfort and perhaps recommends a way forward for how we engage those kids that are marginalized, that are disconnected, that are alone, that are on the fringes of our youth groups, that are on the fringes of the lunchroom in the high school, that are being bullied, that are being ostracized. How do we engage them a little bit differently? And the teenager that I want to talk to you about, he's an immigrant kid. He came as a preteen to his community. The community is one that doesn't have a very good reputation. In fact, it has a pretty lousy reputation as a community. And so essentially it's what we might describe as an inner city or just a low-income area. And in this space, as an immigrant, he struggled to find his place, to fit in. And as a new person, among young people, he finds himself oftentimes on the edges of the accepted cliques, right? And partly that's because of his status. It's not that he doesn't know the language, but it's all the other things that are markers of an insider, right? It's the accent, it's the slang, it's the way he carries himself. And so he's immediately recognizable as an outsider. But for him, there's an even deeper issue, and that is that while he's new to the community, his family has history in this community before his time. And since he's come, it's like he's carrying that baggage. And so he's left to his own devices, and there are days when it's painful. There are days he wants to act out, but his mom tells him, don't act out. It's going to work out. You've got to weather this storm, keep your head up, don't give up. This teenager that I'm talking about, he's not just a friend of mine, but he's a friend of all of ours. It's the life that Jesus chose when he became flesh and blood and moved into our neighborhood, right? But it doesn't start as a preteen in Nazareth, a community with a reputation. It began for him when he was born in a barn, when there was no room for him in the inn, when his parents, his earthly mother, was forced to travel 100 miles through the desert on the back of a donkey in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy, right? When they get to this place called Bethlehem, they're rejected. There's no place for them other than the least sanitary birthing environment I could possibly imagine, which is a shelter for animals. And yet that's where baby's daddy decided that Jesus should be born, in the barn, surrounded by donkeys and cows and all of their stuff that comes along with that. And he's born, and we dress up the story, right? We talk about being wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger, but the manger was the feeding trough. I don't want to touch the feeding trough, let alone lay my brand newborn child in the feeding trough. Yet that's where it happened for him. And when his father decided to celebrate his arrival, he appeared to shepherds, right? Shepherds who were not the most sought after members of society. They were kind of on the fringes, the people that didn't have a whole lot of social status or class. But he comes to them, and the form that he comes to them is the kind of presentation that if they shared with us today what they experienced in the sheep meadow in this visitation from the heavenly host, saying, go visit the baby in the barn, if they relayed that story to us, we'd respond by asking what they were smoking in the sheep meadow, right? We wouldn't laud them as being the emissaries of good news. We would discount them as being people filled with fantasy and something not worth paying attention to. But they were the invited guests when the baby was born. And not just them, but these fortune tellers from the other side of the desert, the Babylonian side of the desert, right? We call them wise men because that's sanitary, but they were reading stars. If the neighborhood fortune teller showed up in your church saying that as they were reading the stars last night, God spoke to them, we'd politely or impolitely remove them from our sanctuary. But these are the people that God invited to the celebration of the birth of his child. And then, as he grows, the king felt threatened by the birth of the baby in the barn. And so he decides to slaughter an entire generation of children that Jesus survived. Jesus had to grow up knowing that a generation of boys paid the price for his life with their blood. That's a heavy burden to bear. And the only reason he wasn't counted among the dead was because they fled as refugees to the country no self-respecting Jew wanted to live in, Egypt. And he grows up as a child, a refugee in a faraway place. And it's only after King Herod dies that they move back, and out of all the places they could have gone, they chose the hood, a community that had a reputation for producing no good thing. That's the neighborhood that Jesus grew up in. I, as a youth worker, take comfort that Jesus could have come in any form, but he chose the most marginalized, most vulnerable, most exposed, the survivor of genocide, the survivor of a refugee camp, the survivor of immigration, the survivor of the hood, grew up the survivor of a politically occupied, oppressed people. He was marginalized exponentially, just like the kid who's on the fringes of your youth group. And I would challenge each one of us to consider, if Jesus was living in our neighborhood, would he be the forgotten immigrant refugee kid that takes too much effort to get to know, that takes too much effort to integrate into the pre-existing clique that we'd formed in our youth group? Or is he the kid that we're going to go out and we're going to engage? Because if we choose to go and engage and reach and see that young man was the embodiment of God himself, it would become a game changer for my youth ministry. That is the reimagined, incarnational invitation I want to make to you tonight. Consider those kids in your youth group that don't have friends. Consider the kids that every time they go to the high school cafeteria, it's the most painful hour of their day because they don't have the clique. They're not part of the in crowd. What are you doing to reach them? If we spent more time and energy supporting those kids, being invested in their lives, I think we just might move the dial on all of the desperation that's driving extreme violence in our communities, that's driving fractures and relational disconnectedness, right? We could see a demonstrated good news in the lives of our young people if we began to recognize in every one of those marginalized kids that they are the 2018 representation of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Let's be about loving them well in the same way that we want to love and enjoy the presence of our King. Thank you so much.